Hello, my friends. Mandy here with a quick invitation for you to join the Patreon for our show. We've recently switched up some of the benefits, including a new monthly workbook to go along with all the incredible content you're getting on the show. It's a quote yourself through grief kind of a vibe, and for only $10 a month, it is a wholly worthy and affordable way to invest in your own healing process without the commitment of a full coaching relationship. Learn more at patreon.com/Mandy Capehart, and of course, the link is in the show notes. Thank you as always for being here. Now let's get into the good stuff. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 108, titled Finding a Rhythm for Blindsiding Grief. I read a lot of books, fiction and nonfiction alike, but I try to spend my time immersed in the content rather than pulling inspiration for my own work. I find that if I look too hard, I'll miss the joy of reading, and that's the whole point of it for me. But this last week, I was reading a novel about a woman in the hotel industry and the way her life had changed. She made a throwaway comment that got me thinking, okay, this is something we need to talk more about. So here we are. This week, we are unpacking what I'll call blindsiding grief, the stuff beyond the stuff that we never saw coming. Blindsiding grief is not losing someone unexpectedly, although the same idea applies. Blindsiding grief is when you notice yourself grieving that which you never thought much of in the first place. Typically, we assume we will grieve the death of a loved one, the loss of a relationship. We understand shared or communal grief, the weight we feel on behalf of the others that we care for, and we know we will grieve missed opportunities or broken expectations, okay? But what can we do to understand our grieving process when the loss reveals an unexplored desire along with an immediately closed door? There are a few ways blindsiding grief shows up in our stories. In the case of the novel I read, it was regarding an unexpected pregnancy and subsequent miscarriage, followed by the loss of the partnership as well. This character never wanted children, felt overwhelmed by the prospect of pregnancy, and struggled deeply with the miscarriage in a way she didn't understand. I don't want to dwell on this example because I really don't want to feed the trope of someone suddenly becoming maternal when one becomes pregnant. Not all pregnant people want to be pregnant, and becoming pregnant doesn't always change their mind. So, as a side note, be mindful of how you speak with someone in a situation like this. It's easy to project our own feelings, expectations, and hopes onto someone without pausing to learn how they really feel about their own life. And isn't that true of grief in general? We're so careful to speak about loss, we put our fears first in the conversation or supportive moments instead of allowing the griever to take center stage. Knowing your own story of grief is 100% different than being a meaningful grief supporter. And blindsiding grief is one of those areas you can allow yourself to practice really listening to someone in their panic and pain. I would almost consider this like level 2 grief support work because in this situation, you're now expecting yourself to handle what feels like a straightforward expected loss, as well as supporting someone while they navigate why they're grieving something they didn't want in the first place. Okay, so let me move to a different example. We'll use one from my life. Quite a few years ago, I worked for a very unhealthy person and I wanted to leave, but I was financially stuck and honestly enmeshed with the person and really invested in the success of the business. When this person fired me for pushing back on their ethically gray workplace decisions, I was entirely conflicted. I wanted to leave, I knew I needed to leave, and yet I felt great loss around the circumstances and my next steps. I noticed myself grieving the loss of my reputation at work within our professional community. I grieved being fired. That was a first. I grieved being rejected and told I wasn't good enough. And I even started believing the awful stories this person continued to tell about me and reading the messages that they sent me. I was grieving my own identity, wondering why I had stayed so long in a situation that felt unsafe and unhealthy, knowing damn well that had I taken a step back to observe the situation from a different perspective, I would have declined the job on day one. I knew part of what I was getting myself into, and I said yes anyway. So, grieving this job loss meant pulling on all the strings it was tied to, and I wasn't expecting to do any of that when I left that job. Years later, that person still comes up in therapy from time to time as I reflect on what I've learned and who I've become. Blindsiding grief from losing a dangerous or unhealthy relationship is really hard for outsiders to understand. We know we're not in a great place, but for everyone else around us to completely miss the nuance of the connection and what we might gain from it is an isolating experience. Even my husband didn't understand why I was still there, and I don't know that I could fully explain it, especially at the time. So, how can we trust someone to hold space for our grief through a blindsiding event when they're so busy inserting their own understanding or opinions in the process? Following this idea a little further takes us to the obvious conversation of unhealthy or abusive relationships. Growing up, my grandmother worked in a domestic violence shelter as an advocate and counselor for over 20 years. And while she wouldn't disclose details, the generalized impression I got was one of compassionate listening and resource creating. Her role wasn't to tell these women and children how unsafe and unsmart they'd been. It was to come alongside them and develop new avenues and opportunities of living for the women and children to grieve and heal in their own ways. While she had plenty of clients eventually return to their abusers, she had so many more experience a fresh chance at life because they were offered kindness when the blindsiding grief finally surfaced. It is beyond complicated to understand why someone would hesitate to leave a dangerous situation, which often feels like permission to judge the griever. We create a litmus test of whether or not we would leave and forget the nuance of connection, history, codependency, enmeshment, family patterns, basic needs being met, all the things, right? There are so many justifications for staying, even when we can point to the justifications to leave as well, that many in abusive relationships remain because at least there, they don't have to constantly justify their decisions. Loss aversion is a huge reason someone might stay in a dangerous relationship. The blindsiding grief when they do eventually leave to find and create safety is also a huge reason why we need more grief literacy in our communities. If we could create a safer place for people to land without judgment or systems or processes and questioning their sanity, maybe the fear of loss and grief work would lessen. Maybe more people would hold themselves to a higher self standard of being lovable and believing they are worthy of respect. We can't know until we allow ourselves as outsiders to a situation to invite those experiencing the lost to be honest with themselves, safe in doing so, and unafraid of being judged for that honesty. To be honest, I've grieved for abusive people when they've died. It feels a bit like self betrayal grieving someone who harmed you. For me, the loss itself was a blindside, as was my response. We keep wanting grief to fit into a nice package, one that we can bundle and sell in 5 easy lessons for a quick weekend retreat. But grief will never make full sense. And yet here we are, continuing to make meaning and gain understanding of our own context and stories in a way that feels like healing, because it is. So, as we continue to recognize ourselves in the aftermath of grief, we learn new things about ourselves and who we are becoming. Think back to your own experience and expectations of life before you knew what grief was like. Were you rigid? Did you plan for the future like it was a foregone conclusion? I did. I had strict ideas of where I was heading, and although the details were fuzzy, my intention was clear. My life would become what I envisioned. Learning to swing with the shifts meant more than simply holding on while gravity threw me back and forth. I had to notice the rhythm to it. There were moments in my grief experience and even future life planning that felt a lot easier to navigate. Pressures alleviated, and I felt like I had some momentum, upward swings, if you will. And of course, there were times I noticed myself really gripping the tabletops, like I would fall off the edge of the world if one more thing added even an ounce of pressure. I feel like blindsiding grief is that gust of wind trying to blow me off course, as if this new and unexpectedly necessary experience of grief can't possibly fit into my already overwhelming life. But each time I've experienced it, it wasn't the loss that made itself comfortable in my life. It was me inviting the grief into my story. We have an idea that we write our own stories and tell our own tales. And yes, of course, that's the power of self efficacy. I'm a big believer in it. I don't believe it's all planned out and scheduled according to a grand plot master. Sorry. But what I believe is that we have a choice to engage the side characters in our story or not. We carry the influence of who we are and who we invite into every side adventure and subplot we are offered. And when my latest blindsiding grief event occurred, I knew I had a choice to include the narrative or to strike it all from the record. But because I spend time exploring what grief means to me and how it impacts my life, I noticed the wind on its approach. Blindsided though I was, I kept my head up and saw that despite what shuffled the leaves in the trees around me, I was grounded. I was prepared and going to survive yet another heavy loss and all the secondary losses that came with it, because I had learned my own rhythm in grief and I knew I would be okay. Thank you for listening to episode 108 of Restorative Grief. As I write this essay, my own blindsiding grief feels a little like an exhale today. The somatic practitioner in me notices the softening of my facial muscles, and while it's not a true smile, it's not a frown either. As you explore your own lived experiences for opportunities to invite more healing, honor yourself. Honor the body that has carried your grief, both blatant and blindsiding, for your entire life. The fibers of your being are worthy of the love, safety, and honor found within a healthy relationship to grief. And while no one wants to grieve, no one has the true option of avoiding it either. So consider today a fresh invitation to dive in, eyes wide open and heart ready to find your own smile again. If this is your first time listening to Restorative Grief, I hope you'll remember that your stories are just as important to tell as anyone else's. Remember what matters, those core values of your being that propel you forward day by day, and thank yourself for making the show a part of that journey. Please subscribe so you'll never miss a weekly episode, and leave me a 5-star shiny review. You know they're my favorite. Those little winks from my listeners remind me that although this work is vulnerable and challenging, it will always be worthwhile. If you're interested in learning more or hearing new content from Restorative Grief, you can check out mandykapehart.com/coaching or join my Patreon or free coaching group online. All of those are linked in the show notes for you. And as always, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.